Good evening and welcome. I'm Anne Walters Robertson, Dean of the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first Dean's Salon of 2022-23 academic year. Our Dean's Salon series highlights the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs of our distinguished faculty. The series explores how the humanities deepen our understanding of the ideas and social forms that shape our lives. Now I have the honor of introducing our speakers, but first, let me share a brief overview of the topic they will discuss. The term civil war resists a simple definition, even among political scientists. It comes from the Latin bellum civile, that is, formal warfare, bellum, among citizens, civile. But in antiquity and modernity alike, civil war has been waged not just in the clash of armies, but also on the battlefields of family, sexuality, and cultural representation in literature, film, and the media. Tonight, our two speakers will engage in a conversation about their recently published and forthcoming books on civil war, highlighting the cultural dimensions of civil war in France, Syria, and ancient Rome. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to this evening's speakers, Michèle Lowrie and Lisa Wedeen. Michèle Lowrie is the Andrew W. Mellon Distinguished Service Professor in Classics and the College. Her research on Latin literature and Roman political thought is currently focused on civil war and security, two Roman concepts with long histories. In addition to numerous residential fellowships, including at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton and the American Academy in Berlin, she has received fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Loeb Classical Library Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Lowrie gave the Gray Lectures at Cambridge in 2018 and the Faber Lecture at Princeton just this fall. A brand new book, Security, Safety, and Care, A Roman Political Discourse, is forthcoming from Cambridge University Press. Indeed, it has just appeared. Maybe Michèle could even hold it up. Yes, no longer forthcoming, it's here. All right, Lisa Wedeen is the Mary R. Morton Professor of Political Science and the College, co-director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, and associate faculty in anthropology at the University of Chicago. She is the recipient of the David Collier Mid-Career Achievement Award and an NSF Fellowship. Her newest book, Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria from 2019, received literally a host of awards. The American Political Science Association's Charles Taylor Book Award, the APSA's inaugural Middle East and North Africa Politics section's Best Book Award, the International Political Science Association's Award for Concept Analysis in Political Science, and just this past spring, the Gordon J. Lang Award for the book that brings the most distinction to the University of Chicago Press. Wedeen is also beginning new work on a monograph on violence and temporality. And now I'm very excited to turn over the virtual podium to Michèle.
So thank you, Anne. I'm delighted to have the chance to share my research on civil war with you this evening. I wrote Civil War and the Collapse of the Social Bond. The subtitle is The Roman Tradition at the Heart of the Modern, jointly with a colleague of mine, excuse me, Barbara Vinken, who is a professor of comparative literature in Munich. Barbara and I first taught a seminar on civil war here at the Center for Disciplinary Innovation in She is a European Catholic of a kind of anarchist disposition who mistrusts all forms of governance. I come from an American liberal tradition rooted in Enlightenment values. I'm skeptical of these values, but also skeptical there are viable alternatives to democratic institutions for mediating conflict. The book instantiates, and this is important for our topic, the possibility of working out intellectual and ideological difference. I'm also delighted that this work has given me the opportunity to be in dialogue with Lisa Wedeen here at the University of Chicago. So if Barbara and I are literary and cultural critics interested in political ideologies, Lisa's a political theorist and cultural critic interested in a wide variety of expressive media. My work with Barbara focuses on ancient Rome and modern France. Lisa will be talking about her work on contemporary Syria. So I'm sure some of you will be disappointed that we're not talking about the American Civil War or contemporary events, but those may come up in the questions. Okay, so in this book, Civil War and the Collapse of the Social Bond, our title and subtitle underscores central strands to our argument. So first, the concept of civil war is insufficient to capture its devastation. Next slide, please. When we say civil war, we are speaking Latin. The Greeks spoke of stasis, taking a stand, or bloodshed among kin, or tribal warfare. Latin bellum, as Anne said, restricts violence to formal warfare on a battlefield. Civile specifies that the war is between citizens. The Roman concept has had a long and fruitful history, long and bloody history. And David Armitage's 2017 book traces the conceptual history of civil war from ancient Rome to the present, and he stresses the Roman heritage. Nevertheless, Latin literature, this is a central point, works against the conceptualizations of its own language by showing that the class of citizen armies pales in horror before social collapse. Latin literature, as you might imagine or know, depicts plenty of battle scenes, but the larger story is told through metaphors and images that stress other categories. Fratricide is one of Civil War's central figurations. We in English use it when we call the American Civil War a war between brothers. That's a figure. The family war is a figure for the Civil War, or vice versa. Family violence insists that civil war concerns social dysfunction as much as political conflict. Love and sexuality are a central field of discord, along with murder within the family. Family and sexuality conflict with citizenship as primary categories of belonging in the Roman tradition, and we therefore stress social collapse. Second, there we go. Our book highlights the persistence of the Roman tradition. And the Roman tradition, it keeps returning to the Roman civil wars as a kind of unresolved original scene. The wars between Pompey the Great, we have him here on the right, and Julius Caesar on the left. I've put a little map of the Battle of Pharsalus for 48 BCE in the middle. The wars between Pompey and Caesar, and then in the next generation, Mark Antony and Augustus, they frame analyses of civil war over reference points. The fact that Caesar was Pompey's father-in-law gives historical grounding for a central figuration of civil war, namely violence within the marriage bond, whether that means alliances linking men to men, as here, or the institution regulating sexual relations between men and women. The century of turmoil that finally destroyed the Roman Republic when Augustus defeated Antony at Actium in 31 BCE left a wound in the political imagination to which this tradition keeps returning. Marx, for instance, says in the 18th Brumaire that the French Revolution was fought in Roman garb, dressed first as the Republic, then as the Empire. His quip casts the French Revolution as civil war and insists on its failure to achieve resolution. He was writing about the 48 revolution, half a century later. Civil war keeps returning. Rome keeps returning. The question is, which Rome? The Roman Republic destroyed by civil war, or the Roman Empire, which ended civil war at the price of moral decadence and a loss of political liberty? Whether we humans can overcome civil war and establish a new and better order is the burning question in this tradition. We analyze conflicting answers. And could I have the next slide, please? Integrating answers imagine a society's refoundation in the wake of civil war as an age of golden peace. Disintegrating answers make civil war part of the human condition. Any provisional end only brings something worse. Our chapters trace exemplary moments of ideological innovation. The texts we examine build on each other and contest prior attempts to address the possibility of overcoming civil war. And we'll stay with this slide. So we begin with two Roman authors. Virgil inaugurates the integrationist strand of this tradition. His poetry, however, is nevertheless fraught with ambivalence. The Georgics, a didactic poem on farming contemporary with Augustus's accession to power, repeatedly stresses civil war's devastation. In it, an allegorical bee society suffers civil war, collapse, and is reborn. Their adulation of their king is compared to Orientalized monarchies. When the bee king dies, they rip apart their hive in a frenzied act of self-destruction. We read this episode as a warning. Augustus risks establishing a decadent empire in an Oriental mode. So Orientalizing is a very strong strand in this tradition. The Aeneid, an epic on Rome's foundation, predicts empire without end, as if that's a good thing, right? Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's not, after Augustus defeated Antony at Actium. That Cleopatra was the enemy along with Antony also enables Orientalizing. The decadent Egyptian other must be defeated. So goes the ideology, where that is really a screen for the internal enemy, must be defeated to establish a glorious new age that will overcome the civil war that has haunted Roman history since inception. In overlapping figurations, including twinning, fratricide, suicide, and human sacrifice, civil war colors the founding moment closing the poem. The new age, however, does not eradicate civil war, but redirects its violence toward imperial expansion. So our second Roman author, Lucan, who is contemporary with Nero, is our first disintegrationist. His civil war between Pompey and Caesar, which took place a century before his own time, it denies Virgil's prediction that Augustus would usher in a golden age. Instead, the Julio-Claudians have perpetuated civil war, not literally, but as an inescapable historical condition. Caesar, who dallies with Cleopatra in Egypt, kills off the Republic and goes native. The Roman Empire goes Oriental along with Caesar, and this ugly othering is a way of condemning Rome's internal moral problems. The poem offers no closure, no redemption. So that's a strong disintegrationist strand. In Augustine's City of God, next slide, please. The advent of Christianity founds, and it's his understanding, a new eternal city. The Romans become paradigmatic of all that is awful about the terrestrial city. The civil wars exemplify the depths of human depravity. Augustine retails these at length, using the language of Latin literature, especially Lucan, to argue against Rome as a viable social order. His alternative, the Christian heavenly city, will finally, in his view, overcome civil war after the end of history. In the meantime, its preeminent value, love, offers a better way to live. We follow the tradition into modernity with two French novels. Victor Hugo's 93 secularizes Augustine's integrationist vision. Hugo casts himself as a French Virgil and cites Lucan extensively. Set in the civil wars in Brittany during the terror following on the French Revolution, the novel's main characters, a great uncle and great nephew, like Caesar and his heir Augustus, fight on the royalist and republican sides, respectively. The final scene is foundational, like the end of the Aeneid, but with a brighter message. A Christ-like self-sacrifice by the republican leader overturns the Aeneid's dark tropes to establish a new republic that, like Augustine's city of God, will redeem civil war. Unlike the Christian model in which all politics are corrupt, Hugo's city to come, in a romantic fantasy, secularizes Christian values. It heals the corruption of the Catholic Church and decadent French monarchy and replaces the Republican terror with love. Our final novel, Michèle Houellebecq's scandalous and bitterly satirical Submission, came out in 2015, so after we started our work on the book. In its dystopian future, the French election of 2022, so our present, erupts in street violence under the banner of right-wing nativist threats of civil war. The traditional centrist parties unite against Marine Le Pen, who actually ran, right, to back the moderate Muslim Brotherhood candidate. The already decadent, sexually depraved, loveless Fifth French Republic converts into a decadent, sexually perverse reincarnation of the Roman Empire, dressed as modernity's new Orientalist target, political Islam. Just as the Roman Republic collapsed in civil war, so does contemporary France. But in Houellebecq's obscene vision, the new Islamic empire reproduces no real Islam, but a hellish, orientalizing Nietzschean fantasy that subjugates women and eradicates male freedom by literalizing the worst of the Western political imagination. In each work, civil war is already here. It's not a question of its beginning, it's here, whether literally as violence or figuratively as social order. Even integrationist answers defer its overcoming to an uncertain future. So whether we can even imagine overcoming discord tracks major ideological shifts that inform the Roman tradition. These are classicism, Christianity, romantic secularism, postmodern cynicism. We don't cover all the moments, but our point is that this tradition allows civil war to articulate contemporary ideological strands. So while Barbara and I were writing, we watched with horror as our intellectual interests started to come alive before our eyes. When we began, the uprising in Syria had been going on about a year. It was difficult to know what to call it. I heard the BBC announce it was definitively a civil war because, for instance, they had found a mother whose sons were fighting on both sides. The potential for fratricide made it understandable. A civil war on a classical model is less threatening than conflict you cannot name. The Roman tradition, I think, remains potent for thinking with because it is fueled by its own internal conflict about whether and how we can overcome civil war. As strong as this tradition is, it nevertheless fails to capture the complexity of internal violence, its representation, and conflicting attachments. And with that, I will turn the podium over to Lisa.
Thank you, Michèle, and thank you, Anne, both for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's an honor. So my book, Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria, based on years of fieldwork, asks, how has the regime been able to bear the brunt of the challenges raised against it? And what does the Syrian example tell us about the seductions of authoritarian politics more generally? My approach to this orienting puzzle identified novel modes of ideological interpolation, borrowing Louis Althusser's term. In other words, new ways of hailing citizens into Syria's autocratic system. From various angles, the book investigated the complicated, varied, often incoherent forms of address that secured enough citizen buy-in for the regime to survive. Next slide, please. Ideology works through seduction, arousing fantasy content while simultaneously diffusing it and smoothing out contradictions. It helps manage collective anxieties and socio-political incompatibilities by providing mechanisms that allow dissonances to be contained, displaced, and disavowed. Next slide, please. As containment, ideology operates by making what are essentially social and historical anxieties seem natural and inevitable, arousing desires and then placing them in check. Next slide, please. This containment also works through modes of hyper-identification when we can fantasize about images of celebrity glamour or elegance or composure or whatever, without necessarily believing that we'll ever be able to emulate adequately the exemplar. Next slide, please. Ideology also works as displacement, in which unbearable fears are relocated onto a new object, allaying anxieties by transferring unacceptable attributes onto a fantasy other, something Michèle's book talks about at great length. Conspiracies of national undoing that put, say, terrorists in quotes at the heart of the problem, or projections of in-group violence outward. These are some processes of displacement which were frequently at work helping to organize collective life in Syria's authoritarian circumstances, as well as its war-torn ones. And perhaps the most provocative dimension of the book's argument, at least for me, about ideology was the account of disavowal. Next slide. Now, the famous theorist Octave Manoni noticed how people would rationalize their lives, acknowledging and disavowing simultaneously. The phrase, "I know very well and yet nevertheless," exemplifies this mode of disavowal, a distancing from accountability that has implications for politics. In the case of Syria, the disavowal typically worked like this. I know very well that the regime is incorrigibly corrupt, and yet nevertheless, we can build government-sponsored civil society organizations that truly empower citizens. Or, I know very well that Sunni gangs did not visit our village in the night, and yet nevertheless, they could have. Or among secular activists in the first 2 years of the uprising, quote, I know very well there are violent Islamic militants among the opposition, but nevertheless, they're not really a problem, unquote. Disavowal goes beyond denial, in that the problem calling for judgment is at least posed. In disavowal, the power of ideology comes into especially bold relief, with subjects hailed into positions where the realities that they can no longer deny can still be dismissed. In this sense, disavowal expresses the contradiction it simultaneously repudiates. So in sum, the book tried to show how ideology matters in cultivating citizens' attachments. It works not only through outright belief, but through mechanisms that complicate belief and unbelief. It can generate ardent loyalty, but also ambivalence. And in the case of Syria, this ambivalence, that toggle between desires for reform and the attachment to order, helped the regime recalibrate its relationship to rule. Next slide. The book also located pathways back to democratic potentiality and political judgment. Next slide. In comedy's capacity for irreverence, in artistic efforts to bypass the impasse of fake news by unsettling the conventions of documentary filmmaking, and in the cultivation of interpretive generosity through imaginative exercises in what Hannah Arendt called representative thinking. These are all important attempts to perform an incandescent otherwiseness to the bleakness of the present moment. Next slide. Operating in conjunction with the promises made by the regime's neoliberal autocracy, ideology trades in the seduction of status quo conventionality in the face of challenges to it. That was chapter 1. It functions in complicated ways through the varied work comedy does, chapter 2. It's evident in the role of fake news and the role it plays, in unmooring political judgments from their frames of reference. That's chapter 3. In the possibilities for appropriating the affective intensities around mourning, as well as Syrian artists' efforts to think with interpretive generosity as political theorists in their own right, when the revolutionary exuberance of 2011 gave way to civil war. That's chapter 4. And finally, in the ongoing modalities of sectarian othering made apparent through, for example, the everyday circulation of rumors, chapter 5. In exploring the limits of rebellion and the seductions of status quo conventionality, my book shows how the Syrian regime managed to produce an ambivalent middle, or what was referred to in Syria somewhat derisively as the gray people, Ramadiyin, invested in stability and fearful of alternatives. In doing so, I argue that what might best be described following Lauren Berlant as an ideology of the good life operated among key metropolitan populations, particularly in the two bit largest cities, Damascus, the capital, and Aleppo, the commercial hub, to organize desire and quell dissent. Syria's good life entailed not only the usual aspirations to economic well-being, but also fantasies of multicultural accommodation and a secure, sovereign, pride-inducing national identity. It's these visions and inducements to compliance in the first decade of President Bashar al-Assad's rule, that's 2000 to 2010, unevenly saturating and in flux, that defined the terms in which neoliberal autocracy was created, sustained, and in the context of the revolution, ultimately reconfigured. Now, the creation of neoliberal autocracy implied two contradictory logics of rule. The one cultivating desires for market freedoms, upward mobility, and consumer pleasure. You saw those first two slides earlier back. And the other tethering advancement opportunities to citizen obedience and coercive regulation. This contradiction was mediated and managed in pre-uprising Syria, in part through a local image world that wedded private capital to regime control in a way officially epitomized by the seemingly glamorous, urbane, and assertively modern first family, packaged as members of a moral neoliberal class. And even though those images of a kinder, gentler, enlightened, chic regime were shown to be a thin veneer, hiding a brutality that would brook no dissent. In recent years, as the regime declares a tentative but by no means assured victory in the war, such images of glamour and glitz have returned. Next slide. The regime's first family aesthetic of loss and righteousness has been used by professional managerial cultural producers who take the ruins of war as cultural backdrop for new television melodramas, churning out scenes that operate in familiar ideological modes of containment, displacement, and disavowal. The rubble serves as testimony to threats combated, order restored, neoliberal autocracy rejuvenated. Last slide. found not only in stylized melodramas, but also in actual photo ops of the first family. The ideological strategy is not to deny the heartbreak and loss so much as to appropriate it, dismissing the mourning of others by containing the conflict in a familiar pre-war promise of upward mobility tethered to regime demands for obedience. In this narrative, the threat posed by the uprising was not merely to the regime, but to Syria as a whole, such that a first family mimesis displaces the threat onto foreign others and Islamic militant domestic saboteurs. Many Syrians today will find these narratives gross and false, but others will accept the familiar fantasy bribe, to use Frederick Jameson's term, according to which they know very well that the brutal regime is responsible for much of the destruction, but nevertheless it could be worse. Or, yes, there's violence, but who's really responsible? The regime and opposition are both terrible. I'm not endorsing this view. In the location of scenes of disavowal amid the ruins of war, the effect of these works is to admit and dismiss the violence simultaneously, at least in official narratives. On offer is a symbolic resolution to the soul-crushing devastation, but the order promised is still tyranny, albeit dressed in J. Crew-like clothing. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Michèle to talk a little bit more about her book by offering up some questions. And we're turning now the conversation into more of a conversation here. And Michèle, I absolutely loved your book. It was totally inspiring to me. And I wanted to start by asking you a kind of more general question, more personal even. You've been consistently interested in the way that Latin literature has understood politics. What made you turn to questions of civil war in particular, given that broader interest?
Well, it's one of those things that if you take Latin in school, you read love poetry and you read the Aeneid and you read, these canonical literature. And at a certain point, it dawns on you more and more that all of the matrix in which everything is operating is one of a society that has been torn by civil war. So the troubles, one might want to call them, start in 133 BCE with this is their narrative, with the tribunate of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, but you get repeated bouts of disturbance. There are different things. One can call it sedition, it's civil war, it's conspiracy, it's whatnot. But there is a full century of disturbance that lasts until Augustus, takes power. And that disturbance, whether it's being talked about or not, conditions the entire sphere of what is left for us to see, which are the literature, the monuments. It's in the archaeology. It takes a while to see it because you're reading some nice love poem by Catullus, and you think this is just like reading a modern love poem. But when you look at it in relation, in the corpus, you see its place in Latin literature. You see that this conflicted affair that he's having with Lesbia is something that talks about the inability to form bonds. And it is this inability to form bonds or bonds that are ripped, whether it's familial or love bonds, that forms a kind of commentary on society. So it really does take a while for it to fully sink in. You have to learn as a reader to see that kind of matrix. I was thinking as I was looking at your slides, somehow hearing you condense your book, in a shorter compass, made it dawn on me more why the book, struck me so very much when I first read it. But the people you're talking about, whether they're the perpetrators or the people who are trying to kind of live in a, a situation where, I mean, the perpetrators of the Civil War, are still in power, you have to, in some ways, make your peace with that. And that, whether you can be in opposition, you can be ambivalent, you can be a gray person, but whatever you do orients itself to the cultural sphere, which is saturated with the autocracy, with the, in the case of Syria, there was an autocracy for which there was a rebellion, at which then, turned to civil war, and the rebellion has to date failed. In the Roman civil wars, we see something else, which is that there was a republic where competition between powerful men ended up, destroying the republic, and what was put in place is something that has, been a model for peace, for centuries since then, which is the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire, in the representations of Latin literature, is simply civil war by other means, right? It is civil war that is repressed, and so. Part of it is that it's everywhere, but the other thing is that it takes a while. It takes a while to read, to learn how to read out what the matrix is in which this cultural production is happening.
Thank you. And I actually did want to say, as you provoked this with your very rich response, that there are a number of Syrians who have not made peace with this. And there are a number of folks in exile, and much of the very creative, imaginative, artistic production is unfortunately at the moment being done in exile. Not all of it is overtly political either, but there are also people trying to re-navigate their worlds and generate possibilities for solidarity in common, but not able to do that in the territory of Syria at the moment. So I would say, there are also multiple oppositions as well, with different orientations towards what it would mean to make peace with the situation. And the situation isn't stable. So it's unclear what will happen in the long run. You were mentioning the French Civil War beforehand, and you invoked the 18th Brumaire. And of course, one of the things, and we'll get to this, I guess, more with the audience's questions too, but one of the things that was so central to me in thinking about parallels, similarities, and differences, in fact, is to understand the ways in which often kind of revolutionary movements devolve into civil war. And if we're thinking about writing about, say, the French Revolution, and we're living in 1791, we're going to have a really different understanding of it than if we're writing about it in 1848, or for that matter, in 2022. And so it's harder when one's trying to do a bit of the kind of theorizing, or differently hard, I should say, and when one's trying to theorize the present without being presentist, when events are evolving so quickly as well, that it's difficult. But at the moment, I would say, as you were mentioning before, there are loyalists, there are people in the gray middle, that kind of ambivalent toggle between folks who wanted reform and also an attachment to order. And there are multiple oppositions with many different orientations towards the situation on the ground at the moment. I do have another question for you, if you don't mind. You and I are both interested theoretically in questions of form. And I wonder if you could say more about your attraction to formal modalities and figurative expression, and how that can help us to understand civil war in the Roman context, as well as, say, in Houellebecq's writings.
So to unpack a bit, Marshall McLuhan's, the medium is the message. I think it's important that the medium has a different message from whatever it's transmitting. So there are, the texts, or it could be films, or artworks. They might be saying something overtly, but their form can say something that is in tension with whatever they're saying overtly. And this becomes a very productive, this tension becomes a productive way of reading Roman cultural production at a time. I'm starting to think of the Roman Empire as being populated by a lot of people in what you're calling the gray middle. There are people who may not like the regime, but they don't feel that they have a strong means of resisting the regime. You were talking about people going into exile, for resistance. So, but nevertheless, the traces of an opposition emerge in all kinds of ways through literary form. And that's, I'm interested in the tension between, this is a kind of literary theoretical problem, like, how is it that a text can be saying something different from what it says? It's like the central, Virgilian question. But you have other authors that operate in analogous ways. And it is in fact this ambivalence and kind of cashing out the extent of ambivalence, whether people tilt toward the integrationist or disintegrationist types of answers, that I'm interested in tracing in the Roman tradition. So the form allows a tradition to continue, because you don't necessarily repeat the substance of what it is said, because that differs. Like, when you have Christianity, they're going to say something completely different. When you have neoliberalism, the message is going to be really different. But I'm interested in how there is a language that allows people to continue coming back to similar kinds of questions. And with that, I would like to kind of ask you about really different types of structures of ambivalence. I think that's one of the things that is I think is fascinating in your book, because I keep the gray people is a kind of satiric barb against the people who can't overcome their desire for stability, even though they have desire for reform. There's something that keeps them from crossing what political theorists call as the revolutionary threshold. And so I'm interested in the differences between those people that one would condemn as not having enough passion, and artistic representation, which may have like a different type of ambivalence. So for me, ambivalence is something that shows commitment. It shows commitment to a desire for reform, even when it's impossible. But these gray people, they might also desire reform, but they're somehow paralyzed.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And let me say that for me, sometimes it is a derisive term, at least it was initially, and it was one that was used by activists on the ground to describe folks who really couldn't make up their mind. And there were different shades of this gray.
Right.
And then there were satires that poked fun at the gray people. There was a lot of stuff going on there, especially initially. I think and so it refers to a demographic category, but it also refers to a sensibility. And I'm interested in both of those things. And that's, the sensibility is one where that toggle is very important, but the demographic actually shifts over time, which makes sense as people are hunkering down and trying to stay safe as the kind of revolutionary exuberance deteriorates into what becomes a civil war conflict. So I think that's very important. But you mentioned the artists, and I did want to say something else about the artists in the minute that is remaining to us. And I think that there's a kind of, maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in the context of other people's questions, but the political effectiveness or efficacy of art, I think, will depend on context. And it's not necessarily necessary to instrumentalize art in order to appreciate it, of course. But I do think it's important not to romanticize art's political efficacies or to write as if it's a panacea for Civil War conflict. And so I hope we'll get more chance to talk about that aspect of things, since you and I are both very interested in artistic production.
I think Anne is going to come and voice the questions.
Yes, well, this has been a most thought-provoking conversation, and I'm sure we could go on in this vein for quite a while, but I would like to turn to our audience. I'm already seeing some really fascinating questions here. We're eager to hear from as many of you as you can, so please send your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll begin with this one. Our first question is in two parts, and it's for both Lisa and Michèle. First, in many ways, it appears the United States is already in a cultural civil war. How does one know that a nation is in the midst of a civil war? Can it be measured contemporaneously or only in retrospect and historically? And then the second piece of it is, can social media, in your view, propel a nation toward civil war? If so, can social media also serve as a tool for ending it?
So why don't I start with the question of how you know you're in a civil war? This is where I will bring back the concept that I want to push against. So you know, it really depends what you mean. Are we in a civil war in the sense of bellum civile? No, we're not, because we don't have armed, you know, in the United States, we don't have armies fighting one another on battlefields as they did in the American Civil War. Now, we see all the time in the media very loose, and I find fascinating, references to how the Republican Party is in a civil war, the Democratic Party is in a civil war. Those are metaphors. I'm interested in the metaphors. Like, when we mean civil war, are we talking about the clash of armies on the battlefield? Well, okay, modern warfare just doesn't work that way. You know, modern warfare works much more through guerrilla warfare, through missiles. The Romans had a very rich vocabulary of all kinds of internal disturbance. There was sedition. We had one of those on the Capitol. There's conspiracy. There's tumult. You know, those are, you know, they would say, one could say that a lot of the protests from the Black Lives Matter movement that we've seen recently would be tumult. So they're fine semantic distinctions, but metaphorically we're in, you know, it's so long as we're sure that we're using civil war as a metaphor, which is one thing I'm very interested in. We're in a moment where we feel that there is some kind of social collapse. And so within the Roman tradition, the answer would be yes, so long as we recognize that's a metaphor. Now, I have no idea about social media. I think I'm hoping Lisa, who works on modern things and modern, ideological channels, might be able to say something about that.
Yeah, I'll start with the social media part then. And thank you for those very insightful questions, actually. And the social media, so I have a chapter on fake news, which I was writing about Syria when Trump came to power in the United States. So I had to go back and reframe things a bit, but in many ways, there were very important parallels. And the argument I make about social media in the context not only of a war-torn country, but I think these are more general claims, is that we're living in a time of remarkable epistemic murk. We're living in a time where there is a kind of overall environment or atmosphere of doubt. That atmosphere of doubt, or that kind of environment of uncertainty, in some ways produces among some people, in certain circumstances, a kind of polarization, siloed publics, the desire to gravitate towards communities of argument that reproduce things you already know and already think. That's something that American politics has, or American scholars of American politics have talked about at great length. The argument that I hope is a little more novel, that I discovered through the Syrian situation, but I do not think is confined to it, is that at the same time that it's producing siloed publics, it's also producing enough confusion to generate alibis for non-judgment, a kind of paralysis, so that people don't actually sign up for one view or another, but are constantly vacillating or are sort of overwhelmed by the kind of high-speed eventfulness of the news, but also the kind of oversaturation. So in contradistinction to many studies of authoritarian politics, it says the lack of information is the problem. I make the argument that in some ways it's the oversaturation of information that produces the circumstances conducive to non-judgment.
That's great. Thank you so much. And here's the next question. Michèle, you said Marx cast the French Revolution as a civil war, and that naming what was going on in Syria to be difficult. Now, so to you both, is there a meaningful distinction between revolution and civil war? And if so, what is it? Does the Roman tradition draw such a distinction between civil war and other forms of internal warfare?
Well, this kind of catalog of categories that I gave before were Roman categories, which do not include the term revolution, which is really becomes a category in the late 18th century with the American Revolution, and the French Revolutions. So the scholar whose treatment of the distinction between civil war and revolution that I like is Reinhard Koselleck, and in his he has this big kind of lexicon of what he calls politische Grundbegriffe, which are political essential categories. It's important to, and so he distinguishes in there between civil war and revolution. So it's important to realize that what you call things is an ideological choice. So the Civil War is a way of saying that this warfare is unbearable and awful most of the time. It can, however, give legitimacy to a mere uprising, right? If a mere uprising, rises to the level of civil war, then the disempowered side, it suddenly gets legitimacy from being called civil war. Revolution is a word that in my span of categories would belong to the integrationist tradition. It says that there can be violent conflict that leads to a better world. Now, a lot of times these fail, but it it has a potential, revolutionary potential to bring about a better society. Lisa, will you?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so in revolution, it seems, thank you, I agree with you that it's an ideological choice as to what we term things. And revolution does tend to connote an aspiration to a transformative politics. And you may get there by way of civil war. That's often the case. The French Revolution is a good example of that. There are many others as well, but not necessarily. But it does seem to me that it does connote a kind of aspiration for a transformative politics that does not exist in the term civil war. Now, political science defines civil war, or, you know, many political scientists used to define civil war, I should say, as any conflict where there are 100 people killed on each side and 1,000 overall. So you need to have two sides, and you need to have a significant number of civilians killed. That is also an ideological choice, to decide that you're going to call civil war that, which makes it prone to measurement, but it also raises a lot of questions, like what counts as civil war onset? And I think it's part of what the question was trying to do was to suggest, can you know a civil war when you're in it? And it does seem to me that in Syria, this was something that bedeviled activists and folks in the gray zone as well, in that some people were starting to see aspects of civil war in Syria, but to call it a civil war was, among activists, to undermine the revolutionary potential. Moreover, in some Syrian circles, many Syrian circles, in fact, civil war initially connoted sectarian war, which was also another way of undercutting the revolutionary promise that many activists held dear.
Right. Thank you. Here's one, an interesting one. Can any participant in a civil war ever claim victory indisputably? And is some degree of generational succession, perhaps multiple rounds, necessary before any definitive judgment on consequences and victory can be made?
So let me start with that one. Yeah, again, these are all ideologically charged terms. So just a little history here. So, you know, after a Roman general, you know, declared, you know, victory, he, you know, if it was viewed to be a victory that was important enough, he was granted the opportunity of having a parade. And the parade would parade through Rome, and he got to ride on a chariot with white horses, and he basically dressed as a god. And this was the culminating celebration of many generals' careers. Romans did, in fact, triumph. This is the parade, was called a triumph. They did, in fact, triumph in civil war battles, but it had to be kind of sandwiched between foreign wars. So when Augustus triumphed over Antony, he was able to triumph over Cleopatra, right? And that kind of externalized the warfare into an imperial war, right? You know, oh, I wasn't really fighting Antony, I was fighting Cleopatra. But the triumph, you know, he celebrated in 29 BCE a triple triumph, which was over. It was over Egypt, that's Cleopatra, Actium, where the Civil War battle took place, and then Illyrium, which is, you know, kind of neighboring territory. So in that case, they did declare a triumph. They didn't use the language of victory. And there, you know, Lucan, for instance, you know, says that, you know, he wants to pull apart, you know, this type of practice. You know, he says very clearly that the winner, is necessarily the loser. So I wouldn't say that you can, participants can claim all kinds of things. Whether their society will accept those claims as legitimate is a different question. So it can vary.
It certainly can vary. I do want to add that even though there can be military victories that historians will see as indisputable, we shouldn't forget the lives lost, the hopes dashed, the ways in which there's a kind of ongoing mangling of lives.
Yeah, thank you. Here's one for Lisa. On a bit more of a personal level, perhaps, were you present in Syria during the civil war? And if so, how did you move between warring sides?
Yeah, no, I was in Syria as the uprising got underway. I had been living there during my sabbatical and was there in March 2011, and I stayed until May 2011. Subsequently, I had to pivot to doing multi-sited ethnographies in different parts, and many Syrians actually came to live in Lebanon. I did some work on the Syrian-Turkish border, but on the Turkish side, and then with folks in exile. It also meant that I had to pivot to online conversations, and that kind of opened up worlds for me. When I lived in, I've gone back in Syria since 1985, actually, when I was a junior in college. I lived in the dorms in 88, 89. I was writing my dissertation in 92 through the 90s. The first book, Ambiguities of Domination, came out through that. Then the book was banned and I was banned for 14 years. I went to live in Yemen for part of that time. Then I came back, and the kinder, gentler vision of autocracy was one that actually did let people like me come back in. And there was at least the veneer of a certain kind of benevolence and freedom that immediately began to dissipate at the beginning of peaceful protest. I was there for those first 3 months of peaceful protest, but it was the second time I had my visa renewed and I wasn't going to be allowed back in. So I was told to skedaddle when I could, but it did actually open up a certain set of research opportunities, even though it foreclosed other ones. I am not allowed to go back to Syria at present.
Oh, it's fascinating. And one other one to Lisa's point about talking about the present without being presentist. Where do you see your work situated in the modern US political context, particularly looking at the events of January 6th, 2021?
Is this for both of us, or?
Well, it says to Lisa's point, but I really think that both of you should address it.
Yeah, well, I think part of not being presentist is also having theoretical underpinnings and using the worlds of the present to tack back and forth between theoretical ideas and concrete practices on the ground, and to allow one to illuminate the other. But in relationship to January 6th, I would say one thing that is quite striking about the United States and quite worrisome is just how armed people are here. And it's much more difficult to have peaceful protests devolve into civil war violence if the regime isn't willing to use arms against its citizens, but also if citizens aren't armed to the teeth. And in this country, that is a very worrisome fact.
Michèle, would you like to say?
Yeah, there was something of a question earlier about how you know you're in a civil war, and do you only know in retrospect? I think this is one of the things that David Armitage focuses on in his book, that there's a kind of clarity that comes when, that this comes, it's created once you're kind of out of the flush of immediate events, and then people develop narratives that will try to explain what was going on. So currently we're in the flush of things. There's a lot of potential for seditious violence. There's potential for tumult. There's not, I think, potential for bellum civile in the technical sense. But it will be interesting to see how, even shortly after, like even 5 or 10 years from now, to see what kinds of categories are being used of our current moment. So, we've settled on sedition for the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. And that's interesting for me because this is of course a Roman category. We had Lisa and I were just at a seminar at Yale on civil war, and one of the participants was comparing Tacitus's account in his histories which tell of basically the collapse of Vitellius's regime, where there was a similar kind of attack on the Capitol, where the emperor ended up going back home. There were these kind of uncanny parallels with what was happening. The uncanny parallels for the January 6th events with what Tacitus's description. So it's the question of how you understand what's happening, always has to do with what categories you're using and how you tell the story. So it will be interesting to see how we end up telling the story, how we end up describing, the events that we're living through now.
Great. Well, this is going to have to be our last question. I want to thank in advance the audience for sending in such really fascinating questions. Drawing from the question on form, what do you think about the inheritance of civil war as a form over time? Why is it that we, a race of political animals, are so beholden to the image and experience of civil war? And how could that relate to our relationship to conflict?
Yeah, maybe I should start with that one. Form is one way of describing it. Another way of describing it would be as a discourse. It is a, what I put under the umbrella of civil war is a set of concepts that don't all necessarily fit, a set of figurations that become conventional, and they can accumulate over time. But there's with discourses, they're useful because they can you can learn them. They become familiar. You can reuse them to talk about new events as they happen in an attempt to make sense of things that are extremely hard to process. So, the attraction of the discourse is that it is fundamentally sense-making. It is not, like any ideological discourse, it's not univocal. It is fraught with contradictions. It is, but the contradictions and the tensions between, say, a figuration and a concept, the tensions those formal, tensions in the discourse are a kind of tool for coping with and managing, I think, the types of tensions that Lisa is analyzing within ideologies. So I see it as a language that that allows us to try to come to terms with things that are really, really hard to deal with.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I completely agree. I would just add to that, that the connotations of civil war do have a sense of civilians participating in the conflict. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, and certainly something that was quite evident in the January 6th effort to overtake the Capitol. And I would also say that listening to civilian activists talk in Syria prior to my leaving about whether to arm themselves or not was a very vibrant discussion in the context of a regime that, what it became clear, was not going to accede to the demands of protesters who wanted real political reforms. So not all violence is also necessarily bad in certain contexts, but it's always going to also create discourses that smooth over inconsistencies, that attempt to make coherent sense of a world that is in fact quite messy.
Thank you so much, both of you. This has been really a marvelous discussion. Michèle and Lisa, thank you for your wonderful conversation and for your insightful responses to what were amazing questions, I think, from our audience. And finally, let me thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, and I certainly look forward to further opportunities for us to connect. As I mentioned, this is our first Salon for 2022-23. I hope to see you again for our next Salon in February, and you'll hear more about it soon. I wish you a wonderful evening. Goodbye.